everyone. Hope you guys are well tonight. So I've had this book for a while, but I haven't got round to reading it yet. It is by Joe Hill, the Black Phone and Other Stories anthology series. And I thought with Black Phone 2 on the way in October, then I'd do read-alongs of each story on stream. So that's starting tonight with the first story, which is called Best New Horror. So the idea is that I'll work my way up to the Black Phone and work my way up to the release of the new film. As I said when I was promoting this earlier on the short, I've not done the first Black Phone on the channel. I did see it when it came out in cinemas, but I didn't get around to doing a review. So I'm figuring I might catch up with that. I might do a review of the first Black Phone before the second one comes out, and hoping to cover the second one in October. Now, if you can hear a buzzing tonight, it's because the pipes are acting up. We've got haunted pipes, it seems, everyone. We are waiting for a plumber to come out and sort it out, which hopefully won't be too long, but we've had it now for a good few days. So, yeah, if you can hear haunted sounding pipes, that's what it is. I guess it will add a little mood and atmosphere to the stream. So I think I'm probably all right reading the whole chapter out tonight. I think it's about 26 pages, something like that. I'm guessing the story will vary in length. So, I mean, what I might do is, if it's a particularly long chapter, I could do it over 2 streams. But I think for now, I'm happy just ploughing on and doing a story per stream. Oh, it's died down. That's nice. Hopefully we won't get too interrupted. But I mean, I'll take breaks anyway. So I'll start the first chapter in a couple of minutes. Best New Horror. I will give people time to roll in a little bit. And this is a first time read, so a bit like when I did Haunting of Hill House last year, that was a first time read as well. And by the way, before I go on and start the story, I should say then tomorrow I'm going to do the second story, which is 20th Century Ghost Story on stream, but it will be for channel members. So that's an exclusive for channel members. Now, I'm figuring I will do most of these just on public YouTube, but that's just a special live read along, which will be just for channel members. So just to flag that one up a little bit for tomorrow night. And the buzzing has started again. So if you give me a few minutes, guys. Yeah, 20th Century Ghost is the second story in this collection, and that's the one I will be doing for channel members tomorrow night. And then I will return soon on YouTube with the third chapter. I say chapter, not really chapter, but the third story. So Best New Horror is the first story, which I will make a start on in a moment. I guess if you've got the book to hand, you could always read along with me. Just give me a moment. I'm going to put the water on. Right. Sorry about that. Just running some water because it tends to stop it from moaning, and then in a few minutes I'll turn the water off, and hopefully it will get rid of the noise. But let's make a start. Reading some of the descriptions. Well, that's about the film. Inspired the terrifying film. And Starbust magazine, which is a sci-fi magazine in the UK. Yeah. Well, I mentioned that to Rachel because it's a reference to Farscape, which is cool. It's the ship. Or, well, it's not the ship, sorry, but it's what they call when the ship takes off or something in Farscape. So that's a cool little reference. But anyway, they say a beast of brilliance that will swallow you whole and spit you back out wearing a big grin. Very nice. Okay. So never read any of Joe Hill's. Of course, son of Stephen King, so big shoes to fill. But he's certainly doing all right because of the success of the Black Phone film, and probably gave a boost to his sales, I would say. Okay, so let's make a start. Best New Horror, the first story. A month before his deadline, Eddie Carroll ripped open a manila envelope and a magazine called The Truth North Literary Review slipped out into his hands. Carroll was used to getting magazines in the mail, although most of them had titles like Cemetery Dance and specialised in horror fiction. People sent him their books too. Piles of them cluttered his Brookline townhouse, a heap on the couch in his office, a stack by the coffee maker, books of horror stories, all of them. No one had time to read them all, although once when he was in his early 30s and started out as an editor of America's Best New Horror, there's the title, he had made a conscious effort to try. Carroll had guided 16 volumes of Best New Horror to press, had been working on the series for over a third of his life now. It added up to thousands of horror hours of reading and proofing and letter writing, thousands of hours of reading and proofing. Oh, I've read the same line there. And letter writing, thousands of hours he could never have back. He had come to hate the magazines especially, so many of them used the cheapest ink, and he had learned to loathe the way it came off on his fingers, the harsh stink of it. Yeah, I hate that as well. He didn't finish most of the stories he started anymore, couldn't bear to. He felt weak at the thought of reading another story about vampires having sex with other vampires. Well, yeah. He tried to struggle through Lovecraft pastiches, but at the first painfully serious reference to elder gods, he felt some important part of him going numb inside, the way a foot or a hand will go to sleep when the circulation is cut off. He feared the part of being numbed was his soul. At some point following his divorce, his duties as the editor of the Best New Horror had become tiresome and joyless. He thought sometimes, hopefully almost, of stepping down, but he never indulged the idea for long. It was $12,000 a year in the bank, the cornerstone of the income patched together from other anthologies, his speaking engagements and his classes. Without that 12 grand, his personal worst case scenario would become inevitable. He would have to find an actual job. The True North Literary Review was unfamiliar to him, a literary journal with a cover of rough-grained paper, an ink print of it, of Learning Pines. A stamp on the back reported that it was a publication of Cavadan University, I'm assuming that's a real university, in upstate New York. When he flipped it open, 2 stapled pages fell out. Fingers. A letter from the editor, an English professor named Harold Noonan. The winter before, Noonan had been approached by a part-time man with the university grounds crew, a Peter Kilra. He had heard Noonan had been named the editor of the North and was taking open submissions, and asked him to look at a short story. Noonan promised he would, more to be polite than anything else. But when he finally read the manuscript, Button Boy, a love story, he was taken aback by both the simple force of its prose and the appealing nature of the subject matter. Noonan was new in the job, replacing the just retired editor of 20 years, Frank McDane, and wanted to take the journal in a new direction to publish fiction that would rattle a few cages. In that I was perhaps too successful, Noonan wrote. Shortly after Button Boy appeared in print, the head of the English department had a private meeting with Noonan to verbally assail him for using the North as a showcase for juvenile literary practical jokes. Nearly 50 people cancelled their subscriptions. No laughing matter for a journal with a circulation of just 1,000 copies, and the alumnus who provided most of the North's funding withdrew her financial support in outrage. Noonan himself was removed as editor, and Frank McDane agreed to oversee the magazine from retirement in response to the popularity outcry for his return. Noonan's letter finished. I remain of the opinion that, whatever its flaws, Button Boy is a remarkable, if generally distressing work of fiction, and I hope you'll give it your time. I admit I would find it personally vindicating if you decided to include it in your next anthology of the year's best horror fiction. I would tell you to enjoy, but I'm not sure that's the word. Best, Harold Noonan. Eddie Carroll has just come in from outside and read Noonan's letter. Standing in the mudroom, he flipped to the beginning of the story. He stood reading for almost 5 minutes before noticing he was uncomfortably warm. He tossed his jacket at a hook and wandered into the kitchen. He sat for a while on the stairs to the second floor, turning through the pages. Then he was stretched on the couch in his office, head on a pile of books, reading in a slant of late October light, with no memory of how he had got there. He rushed through to the ending, then sat up in the grip of a strange, bounding exuberance. He thought it was possibly the rudest, most awful thing he had ever read, and in his case, that was saying something. He had wadded through the rude and awful for most of his professional life, and in those fly-brown and diseased literary swamps had discovered flowers of unspeakable beauty, of which he was sure this was one. It was cruel and perverse, and he had to have it. He turned to the beginning and started reading again. It was about a girl named Kate, an introspective 17-year-old at the story's beginning, who one day is pulled into a car by a giant with just eyeballs and teeth in tin braces. He ties her hands behind her back and shoves her onto the back seat floor of his station wagon, very American, where she discovers a boy about her age who she at first takes for dead and who has suffered an unspeakable disfiguration. His eyes are hidden behind a pair of round yellow smiley face buttons. They've been pinned right through his eyelids, which have also been stitched shut with steel wire and the eyeballs beneath. Yeah, this is graphic so far. As the car begins to move, though, so does the boy. He touches her hip and Kate bites back a startled scream. He moves his hand over her body, touching her face last. He whispers his name is Jim and that he's been travelling with the giant for a week, ever since the big man killed his parents. He made holes in my eyes, and he said after he did it, he saw my soul rush out. He said it made a sound like when you blow on an empty Coke bottle, real pretty. Then he put these over my eyes to keep my life trapped inside. As he speaks, Jim touches the smiley face buttons. He wants to see how long I can live without a soul inside me. The giant dives them both to desolate campground in a nearby state park when he forces Kate and Jim to fondle one another sexually. When he feels Kate is failing to kiss Jim with convincing passion, he slashes her face and removes her tongue. Ouch. I should have done a trigger warning maybe, or yeah, discretion is advised warning. In the ensuing chaos, Jim shrieking in alarm, staggering about blindly, blood everywhere. Kate is able to escape into the trees. 3 hours later, she staggers out onto a highway, hysterically drenched in blood. Her kidnapper is never apprehended. He and Jim drive out of the national park and off the edge of the world. Investigators are unable to determine a single useful fact about the two. They didn't know who Jim is or where he's from, and know even less about the giant. 2 weeks after her release from the hospital, a single clue turns up by US Post. Kate receives an envelope containing a pair of smiley face buttons, steel pins caked with dry blood, and a Polaroid of a bridge in Kentucky. The next morning, a diver finds a boy there on the river bottom, horribly decomposed, fish darting in and out of his empty eye sockets. Kate, who was once attractive and well-liked, finds herself the object of pity and horror among those who know her. She understands the way people feel. The sight of her own face in the mirror repels her as well. She attends a special school for a time and learns sign language, but she doesn't stay long. The other cripples, the deaf, the lame, the disfigured, disgust her with their neediness, their dependencies. Kate tries without much luck to assume a normal life. She has no close friends, no employable skills, and is self-conscious about her looks, her inability to speak. In one particularly painful scene, Kate drinks her way into courage and makes a pass at a man in a bar, only to be ridiculed by him and his friends. Her sleep is troubled by regular nightmares in which she relives unlikely and dreadful variations on her abduction. In some, Jim is not a fellow victim, but in on the kidnapping and rapes her with vulgar. The buttons stuck through his eyes are mirrored desks that show a distorted image of her screaming face, which perfect dream logic and has already been heckled into grotesque mask. Infrequently, these dreams leave her aroused. Her therapists say this is common. She fires the therapist when she discovers he's doodled a horrid caricature of her in his notebook. Kate tries different things to help her sleep. Gin, painkillers, heroin. She needs money for drugs and goes looking for it in her father's dresser. He catches her at it and chases her out. That night, her mother calls to tell her, Dad is in the hospital. He had a minor stroke and please don't come to see him. Not long after a daycare for disabled children, where Kate is part-time in, one child pokes a pencil into another child's blinding eye. The incident clearly isn't Kate's fault, but in the aftermath, her assorted addictions become public knowledge. She loses her job and, even after kicking her habit, finds herself nearly unemployable. Then, one cool fall day, she comes out of a local supermarket and walks past a police car parked on the back. The hood is up. A policeman in mirrored sunglasses is studying an overheated radiator. She happens to glance in the back seat, and there, with his hands cuffed behind his back, is her giant, 10 years older and 50 pounds heavier. She struggles to stay calm. She approaches the trooper working under the hood, writes him a note, asks him if he knows who he has in the back seat. He says a guy who was arrested at a hardware store on the Pleasant Street, trying to shoplift a hunting knife and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. Kate knows the hardware store in question. She lives around the corner from it. The officer takes her arm before her legs can give out on her. She begins to write frantic notes, tries to explain what the giant did to her when she was 17. Her pen can't keep pace with her thoughts, and the notes she writes hardly make sense, even to her, but the officer gets the gist. He guides her around to the passenger's seat and opens the door. The thought of getting in the same car with her abductor makes her dizzy with fear. She begins to shiver uncontrollably, but the police officer reminds her the giant is handcuffed in the back, unable to hurt her, and that it's important for her to come with them to the precinct house. At last she settles into the passenger seat. At her feet is a winter jacket. The police officer says it's his coat and she should put it on. I'll keep warm, help with her shivering. She looks up at him, prepares to scribble a thank you on her notepad, then goes still, finds herself unable to write. Something about the sight of her own face reflected in his sunglasses causes her to freeze up. He closes the door and goes around to the front of the car to shut the hood. With numb fingers, he reaches down to get his coat. Pinned to the front, one of each breast, are two smiley face buttons. She reaches for the door, but it won't unlock. The window won't roll down. The hood slams. The man behind the sunglasses is not a police officer, is grinning a hideous grin. Button Boy continues around the car, past the driver's side seat to let the giant out the back. After all, a person needs eyes to drive. In thick forest, it's easy for a person to get lost and walk around in circles, and for the first time, Kate can see this is what happened to her. She escaped Button Boy and the giant by running into the woods, but she never made her way out. Not really, has been stumbling around in the dark and the brush ever since, travelling in a great and pointless circle back to them. She's arrived where she was always headed at last, and this thought, rather than terrifying her, is oddly soothing. It seems to her she belongs with them, and there is a kind of relief in that, in belonging somewhere. Kate relaxes into her seat, unconsciously pulling Button Boy's coat around her against the cold. It didn't surprise Eddie Carroll to hear Noonan had been exonerated for publishing Button Boy. The story lingered on images of female degradation, and heroin had been written as a somewhat willing accomplice to her emotion, sexual and spiritual mistreatment. This was bad, but Joyce Carol Oates wrote stories just like it for the journals, no different than the True North Literary Review, and won awards for them. The really unforgivable literary sin was the shock ending. Carol had seen it coming after reading almost 10,000 stories of horror and the supernatural. It was hard to sneak up on him, but he had enjoyed it nevertheless. Among the literary cognito, though, a surprise ending, no matter how well executed, was the mark of a childish commercial fiction and bad TV. The readers of the True North Literary Review were, he imagined, middle-aged academics, people who taught Grandrel and Isa Pond, and who dreamed heartbreaking dreams about someday selling a poem to the New Yorker. For them, coming across a shock ending in a short story was akin to hearing a ballerina rip a noisy fart during a performance of Swan Lake. A threeplix so awful it bordered on the hilarious. Professor Harold Noonan had neither not been rooming in the ivory town for long, or was subconsciously hoping someone would hand him his walking papers. Although the ending was more John Carpenter than John Updike, Carroll hadn't come across anything like it in any of the horror magazines, either not lately. It was for 25 pages the most completely naturalistic story of a woman being destroyed. a little at a time by the steady wear of survivor's guilt. It concerned itself with tortured female family relationships, shitty jobs, and the struggle for money. Carol had forgotten what it was like to come across the bread of everyday life in a short story. Most horror fiction didn't bother with anything except rare bleeding meat. He found himself pacing his office, too excited to settle. Button Boy folded opened in hand. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window behind the couch and saw himself grinning in a way that was almost indecent, as if he had just heard a particularly good dirty joke. Carol was 11 years old when he saw The Haunting in the Oregon Theatre. He had gone with his cousins, but then the lights went down. His companions were swallowed by the dark, and Carol found himself essentially alone, shut tight into his own suffocating cabinet of shadows. At times it required all his will not to hide his eyes, yet his insides churned with a nervous, sick frizzle of pleasure. When the lights finally came up, his nerve endings were ringing, as if he had for a moment grabbed a copper wire with live current in it. It was a sensation he'd developed a compulsion for. Later, after he was a professional and it was his business, his feelings were more muted. Not gone, but felt distinctly more like the memory of an emotion than the thing itself. More recently, even the memory had fled, and in its place was a deadening amnesia, a numb disinterest when he looked at the piles of magazines. A numb disinterest when he looked at the piles on his coffee table. Or no, he was overcome with dread, but the wrong kind of dread. This, though, here in his office, fresh from the depredance of I keep saying Button Boy. This was the authentic fix. It had clanged that inner bell and left him vibrating. He couldn't settle, wasn't used to exuberance. He tried to think when, if ever, he had last published a story he liked as much as Button Boy. He went to the shelf and pulled down the first volume of the best new horror, still the best, curious to see what he had been excited about. But looking for the table of contents, he flipped it open to the dedication, which was to his then wife Elizabeth, who helps me find my way in the dark, he had written in a dizzy fit of affection. Looking at it now caused the skin on his arms to crawl. Elizabeth had left him after he discovered she had been sleeping with their investment banker for over a year. She went to stay with her mother and took Tracy with her. In a way, I'm almost glad you caught us, she said, talking to him on the phone, a few weeks after her flight from his life, to have it over with. The affair? He asked, wondering if she was about to tell him she had broken it off. No, Lizzie said, I mean all your horror shit and all those people who are always coming to see you, the horror people, sweaty little grubs who get hard over corpses. That's the best part of this. Thinking maybe now Tracy can have a normal childhood. Thinking I'm finally going to get to have a life with healthy, ordinary grown-ups. It was bad enough she had fucked around like she had, but that she would throw Tracy in his face that way made him short of breath with hatred. Even now, he flung he flung the book back at the shelf and slouched away for a kitchen and lunch, his restless excitement extinguished at last. He had been looking to use up all that useless, distracting energy. Good old Lizzie, still doing him favours, even from 40 miles away and another man's bed. That afternoon, he emailed Harold Noonan asking for Kilran's contact information. Noonan got back to him less than an hour later, very much pleased to hear Carol wanted Button Boy for the best new horror. He didn't have an email address for Peter Kilran, but he did have an address of the more ordinary variety and a phone number. But the letter Carol wrote came back to him stamped "Return to Sender," and when he rang the phone number, he got a recording: "This line has been disconnected." Carol called Harold Noonan at Cafdean University. "I can't say I'm shocked," Noonan said, voice rapid and soft, hitching with shyness. "I got the impression he's something of a transit. I think he patches together part-time jobs to pay his bills. Probably the best thing would be to call Morton Boyd in the grounds of the department. I imagine they have a file on him." "When's the last time you saw him?" "I dropped in on him last March. I went by his apartment just after Button Boy was published, when the outrage was running at full boil. People saying this story was misogynistic, hate speech, saying there should be a published apology and such nonsense. I wanted to let him know what was happening. I guess I was hoping he'd want to fire back in some way, write a defense of his story for the student paper or something, although he didn't. Said it would be weak. Actually, it was a strange kind of visit. He's a strange kind of guy. It isn't just his stories, it's him." "What do you mean?" Noonan laughed. "I'm not sure. What am I saying? You know how when you're running a fever, you'll look at something totally normal, like the lamp on your desk, and it'll seem somehow unnatural, like it's melting or getting ready to waddle away. Encounters with Peter Kilran can be kind of like that. I don't know why, maybe because he's so intense about such troubling things. Carol hadn't even got in touch with him yet and liked him already." "What do you mean? Tell me." "When I went to see him, his older brother answered the door, half dressed. I guess he was staying with him. And this guy, I don't want to be insensitive, but I would say disturbingly fat and tattooed. Disturbingly tattooed. On his stomach there was a windmill with rotted corpses hanging from it. On his back there was a fetus with with scribbled over eyes and a scalpel in one fist and fangs. Carol laughed, but he wasn't sure if it was funny. Noonan went on, but he was a good guy, friendly as all, get out, led me in, got me a can of soda. We all sat on the couch in front of the TV, and this is very amusing. While we were talking and I was catching them up on the outcry, the older brother sat on the floor while Peter gave him a homemade piercing. He what? Oh God, yes. Right in the middle of the conversation, he forces a hot needle through the upper part of his brother's ear. Blood like you wouldn't believe. When the fat guy got up, it looked like he had been shot in the side of the head. His head is pouring blood. It's like the end of Carrie. Bit on the nose, that, considering he's Stephen King's son, but there you go. Like he just took a bath in it, and he asks if he can get another Coke. This time they laughed together, and after, for a moment, a friendly silence passed between them. Also, they were watching About Jonestown. Noonan said suddenly, blurted it out. Really? On the TV, with the sound off, while we talked, and Peter struck holes in his brother. In a way, that was really the thing. The final weird touch that made it all seem absolutely unreal. It was footage of the bodies in French Guiana after they drunk the Kool-Aid, streets littered with corpses, and all the birds, the birds picking at them. Noonan swallowed thickly. I think it was a loop, because it seems like they watched the same footage more than once. They were watching like in a trance. Another silence passed between them. On Newland's part, it seemed to be an uncomfortable one. Research, Carol thought, with a certain measure of approval. Didn't you think it was a remarkable piece of American fiction? Noonan asked. I did. I do. I don't know how he'll feel about getting in your collection, but speaking for him myself, I'm delighted. I hope I haven't creeped you out about him. Carol smiled. I don't creep easily. Boyd in the grounds department wasn't sure where he was either. He told me he had a brother with a public works in Poughkeepsie, either Poughkeepsie or Newbury. He wanted to get in on that. Those jobs are good money, and the best thing, once you're in, they can't fire you. It doesn't matter if you're a homicidal maniac. Mention of Poughkeepsie stirred Carol's interest. There was a small fantasy convention running there at the end of the month. Dark WonderCon or Dark Dreaming Con or something. Dark Masturbate-Con? Very good. He had been invited to attend, but had been ignoring their letters, but didn't bother with the little cons anymore, and besides, the timing was all wrong, coming just before his deadline. He went to the World Fantasy Awards every year, though, and Camp Non-Con, and a few of the other more interesting get-togethers. The conventions were one part of the job he had not come entirely to loathe. His friends were there, and also a part of him still liked the stuff and the memories the stuff sometimes kicked loose. such as one time when he had come across a bookseller offering a first edition of I Love Galesburg in the springtime. He had not seen or thought of Galesburg in years, but as he stood turning through its browned and brittle pages with their glorious smell of dust and attics, and a whole virtuous flood of memory poured over him. He had read it when he was 13, and it had held him ripe for 2 years. He had climbed out of his bedroom window onto the roof to read. It was the only place he could get to get away from the sounds of his parents fighting. He remembered the sandpaper in the sun, the distant razz of a lawnmower, and most of all his own blissful sense of wonder as he read about Jack Finney's impossible Woodrow Wilson dying. Carroll ran public works in Poughkeepsie, was transferred to personnel. Arnold Kilraw. He got the axe 6 months ago, said a man with a thin and wheezy voice. You know how hard it is to get fired from a town job. First person I let go in years. Lied about his criminal record. No, not Arnold Kilran, Peter. Arnold is maybe his brother. Was he overweight? Lot of tattoos. No, not at all. Thin. Wiry. Only one hand. His left hand got ate up by a baller, he said. Bowler, I guess. Oh, Carol said, thinking this still somehow sounded like one of Peter Kilrun's relations. What kind of trouble was he in? Violation his restraining order. Oh, Carol said. Marital dispute. He had sympathy for men who had suffered at the hands of his wife's lawyers. Hell no, Personnel replied. Try his own mother. How the fuck do you like that? Do you know if he's related to Peter Kilrun and how to get in touch with him? I ain't his personal secretary, buddy. Are we all through talking? They were all through talking. He tried information, started calling people named Kilrun in the greater Poughkeepsie area, but no one he spoke to would admit to knowing a Peter, and finally he gave up. Carroll cleaned his office in a fury, jamming papers into the trash basket without looking at them, picking up stacks of books in one place and slamming them down in another, out of ideas and out of patience. In the late afternoon, he flung himself on the couch to think and fell into a furious doze. Even dreaming he was angry, chasing a little boy who had stolen his car keys through an empty movie theatre. The boy was black and white and flickered like a ghost or a character in an old movie, and having himself a hell of a time, shaking the keys in the air and laughing hysterically. Carol launched awake, feeling a touch of feverish heat in his temples, thinking Poughkeepsie. Peter Kilron lived somewhere in that part of New York, and on Saturday he would be at the Dark Future Com in Poughkeepsie, would not be able to resist such an event. Someone there would know him. Someone would point him out. All Carol needed was to be there, and they would find each other. Okay. just take a quick break. Okay, that's powerful. I don't have to put my headphones on. He wasn't going to stay overnight. It was a 4-hour drive. He could go home. He could go and come back late. And by 6 a.m. he was doing 80 in the left-hand lane on 190 on I-90. The sun rose behind him, filling his rear view mirror with blinding light. It felt good to squeeze the pedal to the floor, to feel the car rushing west, chasing the long thin line of his own shadow. Then he had the thought that his little girl belonged beside him, and his foot eased up on the pedal, his excitement for the road draining out of him. Tracy loved the conventions. Any kid would. They offered the spectacle of grown-ups making fools of themselves, dressed up as Pinhead or Elvira. And what child could resist the inevitable market, that great maze of tables and macabre exhibits to get lost in, a place where a kid can buy a rubber served hand for $1. Sorry, severed hand for $1. Tracy had once spent an hour playing pinball with Neil Gaiman at the World Fantasy Convention in Washington, D.C. They still wrote to each other. It was just noon when he found the Mid-Hudson Civic Center and made his way in. The marketplace was packed into a concert hall, and the floor was densely crowded, the concrete walls echoing with laughter and the steady, hollow roar of overlapping conversations. He hadn't let anyone know he was coming, but it didn't matter. One of the organizers found him anyway, a chubby woman with frizzy red hair in a pinstripe suit jacket with tails. "I had no idea," she said, "and we didn't hear from you, and can I get you a drink?" Then there was a rum and coke in one hand and a little knot of curious around him, chattering about movies and writers and best new horror, and he wondered why he ever thought of not coming. Someone was missing for the 1:30 panel on the state of the short horror fiction, and wouldn't that be perfect? Wouldn't it? He said. He was led to a conference room, rows of folding chairs, a long table at one end with a pitcher of ice water on it. He took a seat behind it with the rest of the panel, a teacher who had written a book about Poe, the editor of an online horror magazine, a local writer of fantasy-themed children's books. The redhead introduced them to 24 people or so who filed in. Hello, Clement, how are you? No, it's not mine. I can't claim it. No, this is the Black Phone collection by Joe Hill. So it's an anthology series of horror shorts. So I'm reading them because of the new Black Phone coming out soon. And it's a first time read, but this is the first story tonight. So you can look out for more. Okay. The editor of an online horror magazine, a local writer of fantasy-themed children's books, the redhead introduced them to the 2,000 or so people who filed in, and then everyone at the table had a chance to make some opening remarks. Carol was the last to speak. First, he said that every fictional world was a work of fantasy, and whenever a writer introduces a threat on a conflict into his story, they create the possibility of horror. He had been drawn to horror fiction, he said, because it took the most basic elements of literary and pushed them into their extremes. All fiction was make-believe, which made fantasy more valid and honest than realism. He said that most horror and fantasy was worse than awful, exhausted, creatively bankrupt imitations of what was shit to begin with. He said sometimes he went for months without coming across a single fresh idea, a single memorable character, a single striking sentence. Then he told them it had never been any different. It was probably true of any endeavour, artistic or otherwise, that it took a lot of people creating a lot of bad work to produce even a few successes. Everyone was welcome to struggle, get it wrong, learn from their mistakes, try again, and always there were rubies in the sand. He talked about Clive Barker and Kelly Link and Christopher Golden and Peter Kilrun, told them about Button Boy. He said for himself anyway, nothing beat the high of discovering something thrilling and fresh, and he will always love it. The happy, horrible shock of it. As he spoke, he realized it was true. When he was done talking, a few in the back row began clapping, and the sound spread outward, a ripple in a pool, and as it moved across the room, people began to stand. He was sweating as he came out from behind the table to shake a few hands after the panel discussion was over. He took off his glasses to wipe his shirt tail across his face, and before he had put them back on, he had taken the hand of someone else, a thin, diminutive figure, and as he settled his glasses on his nose, he found he was shaking hands with someone he had not entirely pleased to recognize, a slender man with a mouthful of crooked, nicotine-stained teeth and a moustache so small and tidy it looked penciled on. His name was Matthew Graham, and he edited an audacious horror fanzine titled Rancid Fantasies. Carol had heard Graham had arrested for sexual abusing an underage stepdaughter. Yeah, I should warn you, there's some extreme stuff in this, Clement, just to give you a warning. Although apparently the case had never gone to court, he tried not to hold that against the writers. Graham published, but had still never found anything in Rancid Fantasies even remotely worth reprinting in Best New Horror Fiction about drug-addled mortuaries raping the corpses of their care moronic hits, giving birth to the shit demons in outhouses located on ancient Indian burial grounds, work riddled with misspellings and grievous offences to grammar. Isn't Peter Kilran just something else? Graham asked. I published his first story. Didn't you read it? I sent you a copy, dear. Must have missed it, said Carol. He had not bothered to look at Rancid Fantasies in over a year, although he had recently used an issue to line his cat box. You'd like him, Graham said, showing another flash of his few teeth. He's one of us. Carol tried not to visibly shudder. You've talked with him. I had drinks with him over lunch. He was here this morning. He only just missed him. Graham opened his mouth in a broad grin. His breath stank. If you want, I can tell you where he lives. He isn't far, you know. Over a brief late lunch, he read Peter Kilran's first short story in a copy of Rancid Fantasies that Matthew Graham was about to produce. It was titled Piggies, and it was about an emotionally disturbed woman who gives birth to a litter of piglets. The pigs learn to talk, walk on their back legs, and wear clothes, a la swine in Animal Farm, but at the end of the story revert to savagely. Sorry, I can barely talk tonight. They use their tucks to slash their mother to ribbons and penetrate her sexually. Yeah, this stream isn't getting shared out, is it, to many people? As the story comes to a close, they are locked in mortal combat to see who will get to eat the tastiest pieces on her corpse. It was a corrosive, angry piece, and while it was far and away the best thing Rancid Fantasies had ever published, written with care and psychological realism, Carol didn't like it much. One passage in which the piggies all fight to suckle at their mother's breasts read like an unusually horrid and grotesque bit of pornography. Matthew Graham had folded a blank piece of typing paper into the back of the magazine. On it, he had drawn a crude map to Kilran's house, 20 miles north of Poughkeepsie, in a little town called Peacliff. It was on his way home up a scenic parkway, the Tyonic, which would take him naturally back to I-90. There was no phone number. Graham had mentioned that Kilran was having money troubles and the phone company had shut him off. By the time Carol was on the Taconic, it was already getting dark, gloom gathering beneath the great oaks and tall firs that crowded the side of the road. He seemed to be the only person on the parkway, which would higher and higher into the hills and woods. Sometimes in the headlights he saw families of deer standing at the edge of the road, their eyes pink in the darkness, watching him pass with a mixture of fear and alien curiosity. Piecliff wasn't much: a strip mall, a church, a graveyard, a Texacan, a single blinking yellow light. Then he was through it and following a narrow state highway through piney woods. But then it was full night and cold enough so he needed to switch on the heat. He turned off into Tar Heel Road and his Civic laboured through a series of switchbacks, up a hill so steep the engine whined with effort. He closed his eyes for a moment and almost missed a hairpin turn, had to yank at the wheel to keep from crashing through the brush and plunging down the side of the slope. Half a mile later, the aspect turned to gravel, and he trolled through the dark tires, raising a luminescent cloud of chalky dust. Its headlights rose over a fat man in a bright orange knit cap, shoveling a hand into a mailbox. On the side of the mailbox, letters printed on reflective stickers spelled "Kill You." Carol slowed. The fat man held up a hand to shield his eyes, peering at Carol's car. Then he grinned, tipped his head in the direction of the house in a follow me gesture, as if Carol were an expected visitor. He started up the driveway and Carol rolled along behind him. Hamlocks leaned over the narrow dirt track. Branches swatted at the windshield, wrapped at the sides of his Civics. At last the drive opened up into a dusty dooryard before a great yellow farmhouse with a turret and a sagging porch that's wrapped around two sides. A pine wood sheet he had nailed into a broken window. A toilet bowl lay in the weeds. At the sight of the place, Carol felt the stairs staring on his forearm. Journeys end in lovers' meetings, he thought, and grinned at his own uneasy imagination. He parked next to an ancient tractor with wild stalks of Indian corn growing up through its open hood. It is pretty freaky, isn't it, Clement? He shoved his car keys in his coat pocket and climbed out, startled towards the porch where the fat man waited. His walk took him past a brightly lit carriage house. The double doors were pulled shut, but from within he heard the shriek of a bandsaw. He glanced up at the house and saw a black, backlit figure staring down at him from one of the second floor windows. Eddie Carroll said he was looking for Peter Kilron. The fat man inclined his head towards the door, the same follow-me gesture he had used to invite Carroll up the driveway. Then he turned and let him in. The front hall was dim, the walls lined with picture frames that hung askew. A narrow staircase climbed to the second floor. There was smell in the air, a humid, oddly male scent, like sweat, but also like pancake butter. Carol immediately identified it and just as immediately decided to pretend he hadn't noticed anything. Bunch of shit in this hall, the fat man said. Let me hang up your coat. Never been seen again. His voice was cheerful and piping. As Carol handed him his coat, the fat man turned and hollowed up the stairs. Pete? Someone here. The sudden shift from a conversational voice to a furious scream gave Carol a bad jolt. A floorboard creaked above them, and then a thin man in corduroy jacket and glasses with square black plastic frames appeared in the top of the steps. What can I do for you? He asked. My name is Edward Carroll. I edit a series of books, America's Best New Horror. He looked for some reaction on the thin man's face, but Kilron imagined impassive. I read one of your stories, Button Boy, in True North, and I liked it quite a bit. I was hoping to use it in this year's collection. He paused, then added, You haven't been so easy to get in touch with. Come up, Kilra said, and stepped back from the top of the stairs. Carol stepped up the stairs. Below, the fat brother began to wander down the hall, Carol's coat in one hand, the Kilron family mail in the other. Then abruptly the fat man stopped, looked up the stairway, waggled a manila envelope. Hey, Pete, Mum's social security came, his voice wavering with pleasure. By the time Carol reached the top of the staircase, Peter Kilron was already walking down the hall to an open door at the end. The corridor itself crooked somehow. The floor felt tilted underfoot so much so that once Carol had to touch the wall to steady himself. Floorboards were missing. A chandelier hung with crystal pennants floated above the stairway, fueled with lint and cobwebs. In some distant, echoing room of Carol's mind, a hunchback played the opening bars of the Addams Family on a I can't read that word. Some sort of instrument, anyway. Glicker's spell, I guess. Kilron had a small bedroom located under the pitch of the roof. A card table with a chipped wooden surface stood against one wall, with a humming Surtrex typewriters sat upon it. A sheet of paper rolled into the platen. Were you working? Carol asked. I can't stop, Kilra said. Good. Kilran sat on the cot. Carol came a step inside the door, couldn't go any further without ducking his head. Peter Kilran had oddly colourless eyes, the lids red-rimmed as if irritated, and he regarded Carol without blinking. Carol told him about the collection. He said he could pay $200 plus a percentage of shared royalties. Kilron nodded, seemed neither surprised nor curious about the details. His voice was breathy and girlish. He said thank you. What did you think of my ending? Kilron asked, without forewarning. Of Button Boy, I liked it. If I didn't, I wouldn't want to reprint it. They hated it down at Caverdine University. All of those co-eds with their pleated skirts and rich daddies. They hated a lot of stuff about the story, but especially my ending. Carol nodded, because they didn't see it coming. It probably gave a few of them a nasty jolt. The shock ending is out of fashion in mainstream literature. Kilrun said, "The way I wrote it at first, the giant is strangling her, and just as she's passing out, she can feel the other one using buttons to pin her twat shut. But I lost my nerve and I cut it out. Didn't think Noonan would publish it that way." In horror, it's often what you leave out that gives a story its power. Carol said, but it was just something to say. He felt a cool tangle of sweat on his forehead. "I'll go get permissions form from my car." He wasn't sure why they said that either. He didn't have a permissions form in the car, just felt a sudden intense desire to catch a breath of cold fresh air. He ducked back through the door into the hall. He found it took an effort to keep from breaking into a trot. At the bottom of the staircase, Carol hesitated in the hall, wondering where Kilron's obtuse older brother, had gone with his jacket. He started down the corridor. The way grew darker the further he went. There was a small door beneath the stairs, but when he tugged on the brass handle, it wouldn't open. He proceeded down the hall, looking for a closet. From somewhere nearby, he heard grease sizzling, smelled onions, and heard the whack of a knife. Oh, gee. He pushed open the door to his right and looked into the formal dining room. The heads of animals mounted on the walls. Not one for animal lovers, this. An oblong shaft of one light fell across the table. The tablecloth was red and had a swastika in the centre. Oh dear. I'm definitely not getting shared out tonight. Carol eased the door shut. Another door just down the hall to the left was open and offered a view of the kitchen. The fat man stood behind a counter, bare-chested and tattooed, chopping what looked like liver with a meat cleaver. He had iron rings through his nipples. Carol was about to call him when the fat Kilroy brother came around the counter and walked to the gas range to stir what was in the pan. He wore only a jockstrap now, and his surprisingly scrawny, pale buttocks trembled with each step. Carol shifted further back into the darkness of the hall, and after a moment continued on, treading slightly. The corridor was even more crooked than the one upstairs, visibly knocked out of true, as if the house had been jarred by some seismic event, and the front end no longer lined up with the back. He didn't know why he didn't turn back. It made no sense, just wandering deeper and deeper into a strange house. Still, his feet carried him on. Carol opened a door to the left, closed to the end of the hall. He flinched from the stink and the furious humming of flies. An unpleasant warmth spilled out and over him. It was the darkest room yet, a spare bedroom, and he was about to close the door when he heard something shifting under the sheets of the bed. He covered his mouth and nose with one hand and willed himself to take a step forward and to wait for his eyes to adjust to the light. A frail old woman was in the bed, the sheet tangled at her waist. She was naked, and he seemed to have caught her in the act of stretching her skeleton arms raised over her head. Sorry, Carol muttered, looking away. So sorry. Once more he began to push the door shut, then stopped, looked back into the room. The old woman stirred again beneath the sheets. Her arms were still stretched over her head. It was the smell, the human reek of her that made him hold up, staring at her. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the wire around her wrists holding her arms to the headstand. Her eyes were stilted and her breath rattled. Beneath the wrinkled small sacs of her breasts, he could see her ribs. The flies word. Her tongue popped out of her mouth and moved across her dry lips, but she didn't speak. Then he was moving down the hall, going at a fast walk on stiff legs. As he passed the kitchen, he thought the fat brother looked up and saw him, but Carol didn't slow down. At the edge of his vision, he saw Peter Kilron standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at him, head cocked at a questioning angle. Be right back with that thing, Carol called up to him without missing a step. His voice was surprisingly casual. Yes, surprisingly casual. He hit the front door, banged through it. He didn't leap the stairs, but took them one at a time. When you were running from someone, you never jumped the stairs. That was how you twisted an ankle. He had seen it happen in 100 horror movies. The air was so frosty it burned his lungs. One of the carriage house doors was open now. He had looked into it on his way past. He saw a smooth dirt floor, rusted chains and hooks dangling from the beams, a chainsaw hanging from the wall. Well, does Leatherface live there? Behind a table stood a tall, angular man with one hand. The other was a stump. The tormented skin shiny with scar tissue. He regarded Carol without speaking, his colourless eyes judging and unfriendly. Carol smiled and nodded. He opened the door of his Civic and heaved himself in behind the wheel, and in the next moment felt a spoke of panic pierce him through the chest. His eyes were in his coat. His coat was inside. He almost cried out at the awful shock of it. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was a frightened sob of laughter instead. He had seen this in 100 horror movies too. Had read the moment in 300 stories. They never had the keys or the car wouldn't start, or the brother with one hand appeared at the door of the carriage house and stared across the drive at him. Carol waved. His other hand was disconnecting his cell phone from the charger. He glanced at it. There was no reception up here. Somehow he wasn't surprised. He laughed again, a choked nerve jangling or sound so. When he looked up, the front door of the house was open, and two figures stood in it, staring down at him. All the brothers were staring at him now. He climbed out of the car and started walking swiftly down the driveway. He didn't start to run until he heard one of them shout. At the bottom of the driveway, he did not turn to follow the road, but went straight across it and crashed through the brush into the trees. Whip-thin branches lashed at his face. He tripped and tore the knee of his pants, got up, kept going. The night was clear and cloudless, the sky filled to its luminous depth with stars. He paused on the side of a steep slope, crouching among rocks to catch his breath. A stitch in one side. He heard voices up the hill from him, branches breaking. He heard someone pull the ripcord on a small engine, once, twice. Then the noisy, unmuffled scream and roar of a chainsaw came to life. He got up and ran on, pitching himself down the road, flying through the branches of the firs, leaping roots and rocks without seeing them. As he went, the hill got steeper and steeper until it was really like falling. He was going too fast, and he knew when he came to a stop it would involve crashing into something and shattering pain. Only as he went on, picking up speed all the time until with each leap he seemed to sail through yards of darkness and felt a giddy surge of emotion, a sensation that might have been panic but felt strangely like exhilaration. He felt as if at any moment his feet might leave the ground and never come back down. He knew this forest, this darkness, this night. He knew his chances not good. He knew what was after him. It had been after him all his life. He knew where he was, in a story about to unfold an ending. He knew how these stories went better than anyone, and if anyone could find their way out of these woods, it was him. Okay. Whoa. Okay, so that's the end of the first story. Grueling, traumatic stuff. Powerful stuff, but yeah, pretty good. I have complaints, but pretty good. I think some of the name dropping got a bit much. Some of the references were a bit kind of on the nose at times, but yeah, pretty good. I didn't expect it to be that strong though. So 20th Century Ghost is the next story, which I will read, as I said, possibly tomorrow, maybe for channel members, but there will be another public reading on YouTube soon. But thanks everyone. Thanks Clement for dropping by and chatting. More of these soon, more live streams soon, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care. A little bit. It was quite intense. Wondering what was going to happen to him at the end there. See you later, Clement.